Poso, kia ora, and hello. My name is Frances Turner. I'm coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand. I wasn't born here. I was born in America, and I moved here in 1993. I am an Indigenous woman from the Menominee Nation and the Mohican Nation, and I am also European. That will become important, and you'll understand why I'm speaking about that later on in this conversation. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Writer's Workout for even asking me to do this. It really drew the imposter syndrome out because here I was being asked to, talk to you about claiming your voice, and I am very much an emerging writer. So the imposter said, "Who are you to offer any advice to anyone?" And yet, I've also been told in my life that when you're asked to do something, you step up and you do it. So I've titled my talk, Claiming Your Voice, or better yet, How to Increase Your Own Self-Belief as a Writer. So what I'm intending to do is offer you some tips that I thought I wish that I'd written or that I would write now to my younger self. Let's put it that way. And and thank you again to the Writer's Workout because being asked to do this, I really, I ruminated on this for a while, and I'm not an academic, and I'll explain that in a bit. So I thought, again, who am I to do this? But that whole process has helped me actually reclaim my voice or my voices. And so thank you for leading me back to my own voice and helping me regain the confidence in my own voice. I'm feeling better about the journey that I'm on. And so I'm looking forward to just sharing a bit of my journey, some tips and techniques along the way, things that have helped me. And again, hopefully will help you increase your own self-belief as a writer. I think fundamentally in life, good relationships are built on trust. And we need to trust ourselves and our own voice if we're going to write. So, is there an imposter in this room? Well, my inner voice would tell you that definitely there's an imposter, and it's not you, it's very much me. But that's my inner voice, and I have to bat it away quite often, quite frequently. And I suggest if you battle with the same thing, just ask it what's its source of information, thank it for sharing, and send it on its way because we all have stories to tell. I don't have an MFA. I don't have an MFA in creative writing. In fact, my degree was in accounting and IT. So I can't offer an academic approach today, but I have been published, and that continues to be an extreme thrill for me. And I also won the most incredible accolade for me so far was from this very organization, the Writers Workout, when I won the Judge's Choice in the 2021 Writers' Games. And I cannot tell you how shocked and over the moon I was when I got Teresa's email. I'm very much an emerging writer, though. I call myself that because while I've written in many ways throughout my life, and almost always throughout my life and throughout my career, I've only recently, over the last 4 years, concentrated specifically, nearly 5 years, specifically on writing creative fiction and nonfiction. And, it was in 2019, after a few massive life changes, that I decided I wanted to write creatively. So and it was for fun, and it was as an art, as a creative outlet. But I guess I knew I had things to say. And I just, I'd often talked to myself in difficult times, in turbulent times. And I would go for walks on the waterfront, particularly with one of the jobs that I had. And I would, it might be the organization or myself or both were going through some really difficult times. And I used to tell myself the story. It was like I would take myself out and I would show myself the story of what was going on and how we were going to get through, how the characters were going to get through. And it allowed me to see the sky rather than just trudging through the mud. And I think, those sky stories are really important in our writing. So while our characters, we navigate the mud and we take our characters on these journeys, but our stories are so much larger than that. And I think, that's what I find is where the passion comes from as well. I can't share my story in any other way than just the journey that I've been on. So in 2019, I took a writing course. It was very much about the hero's journey. Okay, I learned some things out of that, but then I found another writing course, which I really found valuable because it was 6 different workshops, 6 different pieces of the craft of writing. So dialogue was one of them, um, tone was another one, pacing. There were different aspects of the craft of writing, that and even vocabulary and like character description, shall I say, and setting description. So very much how we wrote those things. These were part of these workshops, and they were interactive and with people in the room, and they were fantastic. And in 2020, we all know what happened in 2020. I was due to travel the world. Instead, I found myself in a very long lockdown, and the gift of that was I started entering writing competitions. And I did it deliberately because I thought, okay, I have a little bit and I've been starting to write stories, but I really want deadlines and I need some prompts. And I really would love some feedback because I'm writing in isolation. And so I was very lucky. I started writing into competitions, and then I was invited into an online writing group, which I'll just say those two things were two of the greatest things I've done for myself in this writing journey. Was joining an online, very supportive and wonderful, and full of fantastic writers. My writing group, it's international, and also writing into competitions. I've been forced into genres that I never would have tried, never would have touched had I not been given those prompts. And I have even written screenplays for which I have found that, in a screenplay, you can only show, you can only relay what we can hear and what we can see. We don't get to tell you or even intimate really what the character might be feeling. We can't offer all of that backstory, if you will. We need to roll it out, if you will, in front of the camera. And I found that really, really helpful also for honing the voice of the stories that I tell. So, what is the writer's voice? Well, I've shared, in fact, you're only hearing my voice during this presentation. And while that wasn't necessarily created for irony, it's just something I felt more comfortable with. But I just wanted to present a few things on the slides as I was going through, and one of them being this. So, the writer's voice is, of course, the blend of the writer's personal style. It's really the way that the writer is going to tell a story. So, I believe that our writing is a gift for the reader when I'm thinking positively about my own writing. It's a gift for the reader. And it might be one reader or it might be the entire world, and well between, somewhere in between is more often the case. But, I've also thought often, and I remember often, that if my writing can touch just one person, then that's great. And sometimes that person may just be me. But if our writing can reach out, and somebody else can hear our voice and they're maybe uplifted by it, or they think about something differently in the world because of it, then I think that's a real win. So, the way that we write, some people offer their gifts in, stuffed with research, and some people offer their gifts in the most rich and lush poetic language, as if they've written an entire book or an entire short story out of poetry. And some are very comedic. Some make us laugh. And some write us deep into these worlds that they've created, whether it's maybe fantasy or magical realism or sort of even dystopian futures. And I think what I've enjoyed a lot is playing in all of those sandboxes. And again, going back to the competitions, I have been prompted sometimes to write in genres that I wasn't necessarily comfortable in, and maybe that I've never even hardly read, or and certainly never tried. But in going there, I think I've really flex some muscles, and I think the flexing of muscles is what's really important for our voice. It's much like singers, they need to do voice exercises, so why shouldn't we be flexing our muscles in different ways and then finding what really suits us. But again, our voices are perceived by our readers. So what I hear on a recording of my voice is different to what my voice sounds like when I'm speaking to my ears. And so it's much the same, I think, with our writing. Sometimes what we're writing, what's coming from us, the reason, that personal expression of ourselves, what we're writing isn't necessarily everything that our reader is going to derive or feel out of our story, but that's actually okay, because we also need to leave room for our readers to bring their own experiences and their own intelligence to take from our stories what they're going to take. And so it's kind of it's an interesting relationship, that writer and the reader relationship. And I relate that back to books that I've read, and I've related that back to sometimes I'm in the mood for a particular genre or a particular story, and sometimes I don't have the capacity for whatever reason to read someone's work. So I put it back on my anticipation shelf and I'll come back to it. And then in that right time, in that right space, that author's work can just sing for me. So, what am I saying? Again, our personal expression. What's important is that we are sharing the stories that are important to us. So, where does our voice come from? I really believe that voice encompasses the things that we as writers care passionately or deeply about. So when we care deeply, when I care deeply about my characters, their cause, their mission or purpose, the message that they need to share, their loneliness, their fears, their triumphs, their rising from a situation, their ability to laugh at a situation or see the light in it, whatever that journey is, that's when I feel my voice spills onto the page and really fills out the writing. That's when I really get into a flow and this story just kind of, it jumps off the page, I suppose. And so I, again, writing the things that matter to me, and that personal experience of my life that comes in, that I do feel passionately about or I've experienced really deeply. Those are the stories that come through for me. So I'll give you a couple examples. I love writing the hard stuff. So I love giving voices to characters who don't have a voice of their own, who maybe seek justice, but are meek and mild and timid. And, I've had that in my own life experience of not feeling like I had a voice at a particular point in time in my life when I wish I'd stood stronger for myself. So in one of those instances, it was a job, and there were some really challenging people in this job. And I got a prompt for a story, again, back to competitions. I got a prompt for a story, and it led me into an area of, I ended up using the Hermitage cats. There are a bunch of, through some research, I found that the Heritage Museum in St. Petersburg has a whole bunch of cats that live in their basement. And those cats became the basis of the story that I called The Flying Fur Rebellion. I gave voice to them, and they rebelled against the director of the museum, because he was wanting to expel them from the museum. He no longer wanted to give them a home there. And yet they'd been there for, centuries, right? And so this story came out, and it was, in fact, a cathartic way of telling another story, another experience of my life. But it was funny. I used a lot of dialogue for a bunch of cats who normally wouldn't have a voice. And so that was quite a fun journey. And yet I was still writing a story that I felt like mattered because it was a story about rising up. But, I used cats to do it. I also wrote a story. I got a prompt one time in a competition for a taskmaster. And the taskmaster, I went away and I thought, oh, what does that lead to? Okay, that could be a slave, a slave master. And so for me, that made me think either Egyptian slavery, African American slavery, or maybe something in the dystopian future. And I was really mulling this around, and I was sharing, again, online writing community plug here. I was brainstorming ideas with someone in my online writing community, and I, mentioned that these were the kind of areas that I was thinking about, and this is what I was thinking about for my prompts. And the
the person said to me, well, which of those scares you most? And I said, well, obviously the African slavery. And because I felt that I am not African American, and writing as an African American slave, I would be not, that I didn't have a place to do that. That felt wrong to me, like some kind of appropriation. But the person said to me, well, if that's what scares you most, that's what you have to write. And so I really took a deep breath, and whew, and I realized at that point that the way I could write that story was, again, using an inanimate object. I could write a story from the perspective of the whip and the the slave master's whip. And I then was able to, I really researched, and I found a way into that story to give voice to the slaves, but equally to give voice to another slave, which was the whip, because that whip found that they hated that job. And what I used as my experience into that story was my own experience of really hating a job, and really, or not agreeing with the direction an organization was heading, or its values, and why they were doing what they were doing, and how it was that I came to that, and how I needed to rise through that, and move on, obviously. But my story, my historical fiction story, then was written from that perspective of a whip, and I felt like that was a valid way in, because it was another perspective that I could write from, but I could write a story that really mattered and felt real. And by the way, I was longlisted in a UK competition for historical fiction. So yeah, I was very proud of that. And my third example was the story that I won the Writers' Games 2021 Judges' Choice Award for, which again still blows my mind, but was such an amazing gift to me. Was a story that I wrote from the perspective of a lighthouse. So our prompt was to have a landmark, very much a key part of the story, and or almost central. And I just had this sudden thought that actually I want to write the story from the perspective of a landmark. And at the time, I didn't know exactly what the landmark would be, but I ended up landing on a lighthouse, and I had to ask special permission, but Teresa gave me special permission, if you will, to write from the perspective of a landmark. And I wrote this story about the lighthouse, and what the story really was about was feeling lonely and no longer useful, or maybe people come and see you every once in a while. And what it really did for me was I'd had experience of spending a lot of time with someone who had been in a retirement village. It was my partner's mother, as she was on her final journey out. And I had a lot of time giving care to her, but she really had lived by herself for many years. And while she was surrounded by a community, I could sense that, she was lonely. She didn't see her family very often. And so that really kind of inspired this story. And I thought a lot about my own mother, and that I don't see her very often because she lives in the United States, and how that might feel as we get older and we feel less useful, if you will, to the world. And so I wrote that story about, it was very much about connection and the distance between connections. And so, yeah, it was something that felt very personal. It was something that came, but I really enjoyed giving voice to someone or something where I felt like there wasn't a voice. And those I enjoy doing that, even in writing from a human character, if you will. I enjoy giving voice to those that don't have a voice. But that's my writing voice, and there are many ways to attack that. Again, in comedy, in satire, there's all sorts of different ways to do that. And I think that's that source of voice that we all find. Te kowiaki anik aswesian. Machwal na totem o metnamini na tauem. What I've just spoken is my Menominee language, and I have shared that my name is Wave Woman. I am of the Wolf Clan, and I am of the Menominee tribe. I speak a little bit of my indigenous language. I speak a bit more of other languages. And I believe that if we can speak multiple languages, then we can also have multiple voices in our writing. I have written predominantly till, this year really, or this past year. I've written mostly English speaking stories, if you will. But I am now in the process of writing a memoir of my journey, of my reconnection with my heritage. And I then am also claiming a voice as an Indigenous woman. And that's a very exciting and kind of scary journey, but that's a journey that I'm on. So some may argue with me, but I believe we can have many voices in our writing. And a good example of that for me, a really obvious one to me anyway, is J.K. Rowling. And whether you agree with, her views on certain things or not, I don't think anybody can argue that her Harry Potter voice is very different than her Cormoran Strike novels as Robert Galbraith, the author. So I do believe that there are examples of, so many authors that have written in multiple different voices in different genres, and I think that's fun, and I think that, frees me up to know that I can play in different sandboxes, and that I can bring stories to life, again, with maybe different voices, even in how I tell the story, or why it is that I am telling the story, because the why we tell a story, again, I think is really, really important. So, if we can learn and we can speak multiple languages and we can enjoy different cultures, then, again, that gives us room to play and experiment and to grow without the need to feel like we have to categorize ourselves. It allows us to just write and to write what feels good. And it's like finding the clothes that fit best for an occasion. Right? Sometimes we might wear black and white, and sometimes we might wear a whole lot of color and scarves and jewelry and all the rest of it. So, and our stories are like that. Sometimes they're really, more maybe straightforward or straight down a line of a genre, and sometimes we might even blend genres to put a story together. So, our voices and, again, our voices and our character voices, they are different. Our voice and how we write a story might be different, very much different than the actual character voice that we have. One example I have, again, from my own writing is I wrote a short piece of fiction one time based on some prompts, and it was a horror story, if you will, about a coroner who was the actual serial killer, but because he's the coroner and he's now he's doing the autopsy on one of his own victims, he gets to deceive the detective who comes in to find out, hey, what have you learned? And so that voice, I don't even know where that came from. I don't know where that character and that story came from. But I really wrote into it, and I really, really enjoyed it. But that wasn't necessarily anything ever from my experience. And not necessarily from my life experience, but it was also something that, my character was just sharing a voice that I've never had before. And that was really exciting. So, our characters will have their own quirks, their own voices, their own menace, or their own frivolity, or whatever it is. And that's quite fun. But our voice and the way that we write those things, the way that we craft things, the way that we use our pacing and our tension, and whether we like to use dialogue or rich language or unique vocabulary, that's the voice that we have. So, how have I honed my voice? As I said, I've really began this journey seriously. I did take a creative writing course back in 1994, and I have written most of my life. I think I've said that already. But in really, really knuckling down since 2019, and particularly in 2020 and beyond, my pathway has been very much more focused on writing and the creative writing and the creative nonfiction, and now the memoir space. So practice, 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 of course. We just have to keep doing it. I don't necessarily write every single day, or at least not into a story every single day. I usually try and journal something every day. And whether that's just a personal diary note or something, I at least try and put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard every single day in some way. And sometimes it could be as much as doing a clever Instagram post while I'm traveling and tell a little story about what I've just seen. That can be practice as well. The idea of the morning pages is fantastic, but I'm not always the morning person. So sometimes I write nighttime pages. So I don't necessarily have a strict routine. I've talked about a couple of the courses I've taken. One of the other courses that I took was a memoir course run by Alison Wearing. And so I must give credit to the idea of the sky. She talks a lot about sky writing. And her course, Memoir Inc., was fantastic for me in the wanting to capture and write a memoir. Mostly, my idea is writing the memoir for my own children and for my own family of my reconnection with my tribe. But now that I've been back to the reservation and really connected deeply into my own tribe, my tribe wants to hear my story. And other people who I've shared my journey with verbally want to read the story that I'm going to write. So there is a little pressure, but that's okay. I'm all up for that pressure because it's something I feel passionately about. It's something I feel really strongly about, and I want to give voice to that story of my reconnection. So that course was unbelievable. And it also had its own writing community in it of people who are writing memoir as well. And memoir writing is different than the other creative fiction and creative nonfiction. And, I won't try and summarize Alison Wearing's course. If you want to write a memoir, I highly suggest that that's a fantastic resource. But also reading other authors. Of course, we have to read, right? We have to read to be writers because we get to examine what other people say, how they say it, again, how they craft their work, what really resonates with us, what are the ways that we can tell stories. And there are so many different ways that we can tell stories. And I think that's one of the real beauties. And I read all sorts of genres depending on the mood I'm in. It's like going to a buffet and thinking, well, I'm only tonight going to eat beef. That never works for me. I might eat salad. I might have all sorts of different things from that buffet. And my library is a whole range of stories. So I find that very enriching, and I learn different things. When I read these stories very much from what was the author doing? How was the author crafting this? How are they relaying this story? Are they telling me everything early on about someone's backstory, or are they letting that pepper all the way through and maybe some little magic final element happens in the last 3 pages and there's that full and final ta-da moment. So I read for the craft as much as I read for the stories. I've already talked about entering competitions and receiving feedback. Learning how to give and receive beta feedback has been one of the greatest things that I've learned as a writer, because giving the feedback means I have to really read someone's story and see what it is that I'm suggesting may or may not be working for me in their writing or in that story that they're trying to tell, or maybe what else it is that I feel like I want to know, or I offer, hey, this is what I'm thinking you're trying to say. Have I got that right? And equally, and that just makes me reflect back on my own work, of course. So I think that makes me a better writer because I'm thinking a bit about that as I'm editing my stories, not necessarily when I'm drafting the story, but certainly when I'm editing the story. And the receiving feedback has just been phenomenal because I can take or leave the feedback. Some feedback is really critical and harsh, but that's okay because I'm ready for that. I often say when I'm asking for feedback, give me a 4 out of a 5. So a 4 is like, really tell me critically what you're thinking about this. Don't hold back, but don't kill me. don't take everything out of my balloon. Leave me a little bit of breath left to tell me what you actually liked, what I need to retain, what I could amplify, what part of that story that I'm telling or the way that I'm telling it did you love? Was it a particular sentence or whatever it is? And another thing that I have found really helpful is after writing, whether it's a chapter or it's a whole short story or whatever it is that I'm writing, I print it out and I walk around in my house and I read it aloud to myself, and I listen not just for what makes me happy or, is the story conveying, but I literally listen to myself and find out whether or not I'm tripping up on my tongue when I'm trying to read a sentence. And I think it really helps. Does the reading aloud, I think when we're typing, or when I'm typing away my story, it seems to me like it's all flowing. But when I read it aloud to myself, sometimes I realize something's missing, or it's not conveying properly, or as I said, it's too tongue twisting. And I realize that I've said that 4 times in a row, or I've, started 4 sentences with I. I also find Pro Writing Aid fantastic for for that kind of sense checking on my work as well. And I've recently employed Scrivener to work on a full length work, and I'm finding that that's very helpful for me as well to help pull everything together. But I won't give any further plugs for those things. But I do use those tools to help me be a better writer. But the reading aloud allows me to almost hear it the way that my reader might hear the story, and I sometimes will really feel the story the way that hopefully I would like my reader to feel. So those are some of my tips. There will be others that others will share, but those are ways in which I have honed my voice. So I think it's really important to talk about one element of, and this is certainly something that's happened for me. So comparing my voice or not to other authors. So absolutely it is vital to read other authors, to see how they write, how they craft, how they speak through their words. Is it lush and poetic? Is it really funny? Is it light? Is it heavy? Whatever. And those comparisons, how they've crafted, the structure they've used. Do they use punctuation or do they not use punctuation? Do they write in letter style, email style? There are all sorts of different ways that we can learn from other authors as to how they tell their stories, how quickly they divulge someone's backstory, for instance. I've talked about these things already. But what is important is, while we can compare a bit, or maybe not even using that word, we can draw a bit and learn a lot from how other people write. But it's so vital not to go spiraling down that deep, dark rabbit hole of self-comparison, because for me, what that translates into is the imposter syndrome. Starts singing like she's singing an aria in an opera, and she then is telling me my work is not nearly comparable, it's not nearly good enough. So I think it's really important to take hints and look what authors do, how they plays with words and sentence and structure, and perhaps even the techniques that we really like, and find what we love. Is it the phrasing, the pace, the messages themselves? But don't try and be someone else. Do not try and be someone else. Welcome and indulge and trust your own voice. And I'm reminded of that because, again, I said it in the beginning, this journey of even writing or creating this workshop really was something that has really helped me, because in writing my memoir, I hit a point when I was really afraid of how I was treating the characters, because these characters are real people. And I really was stifling my own voice. I was reading all sorts of other memoir and seeing how wonderfully everybody created their characters and their stories, but I was dreadfully afraid of exposing my characters. And I really got stuck behind that. And I recently took myself on a writer's journey, yet another tip. It was fantastic. On the basis of a conversation I'd had with my writing mentor. Also a great thing to do if you can get a writing mentor. That's a fantastic thing. I was awarded one of those last year, which was amazing for me. And I went on this writing retreat, took all the distractions away, turned off my emails, turned off everything else, told everybody in my life I'm pretty much going to be out of action for a week. And yet while I was there, I was still feeling very stifled. And I had a vulnerable conversation, if you will, or I became vulnerable in a conversation with the other writer in residence. And I shared that I was really afraid of how I might treat my characters or how they might be conveying. And what I realized I was doing was I was already editing, or I was always reading the final version. I was already there. And I was already afraid of what my daughters might think, or my mother might think, or what everybody else might think of my story. And the other author said to me, from what I understand of you, you will take care with these characters. Just let yourself write. And I'm paraphrasing, but that single conversation, me being vulnerable to say, this is what I'm fearing most about what I'm writing at the moment. It's very personal to me. I feel like I need to edit this whole section out because I'm afraid of sharing it. When she kind of spoke back to me and said, I believe you'll take the care and you will honor those characters, that opened the floodgates again. And I wrote and or revised work that I had. I got 30,000 words done in a week. And I didn't want to leave that retreat, but I had to go and, get back to normal life. But that writer's retreat was amazing because once I finally unlocked and let my voice flow again, those words just flew onto the page. And as I was writing, I was realizing she was right. That other author was right. I was taking care. And I was allowing everything to go onto the page, even if I was a little afraid of it, because you know what? It might not end up in the final story, but I had to let it all flow out there because I'm still in the drafting mode. I'm still writing the first draft, if you will, and I then will get to edit, and I'll get to shape, and I'll get to take care. I will get to massage that story appropriately for later on. But again, in comparing myself, I was just freezing myself out of writing. And so I just suggest whatever you do, take from other authors what we can learn from them, but your voice is yours to share, and just let it sing.
So I suppose the final thing I want to say is that it's up to us to share our voices. We need to be brave, sometimes vulnerable. In fact, a lot of times vulnerable because rejection's a big part of the game. But, the more I've sought feedback, which is invaluable, the more ready for critique I am, and the more I recognize that my stories aren't for everyone. But our stories can often find their right home if we are persistent enough. That's what I have found, although I will admit that at the moment I am so focused on my memoir that I'm not participating in any other competitions at the moment, which sometimes I worry about because I wonder if I'm not honing my voice well enough, but I am finding that my voice is flowing so well through the memoir writing that I'm doing that I'm wanting to sustain that and just stay there. I will take a break in the middle of the year and I will do the Writers' Games again because I love that competition so much and I find the feedback so great. But I love everything about that competition and getting to write those stories. But share our voices. Like I said, have that courage, find that courage, and submit the work. Submit your works to publications, online publications, and magazines, and also to or to agents or whatever. Go those big routes with the big works. Whatever it is that you're writing, just share it. Share it with friends. See what friends think. I just think our stories are there. Our stories are our stories. Everyone has a story, and we're lucky enough to be doing the work to write them. And so they're meant to be shared, and there is an audience. And so be brave. Throw it out there, put it out there in the universe, and let your work find your audience. Good luck.